Good morning, everybody. It's 2:31. I've seen that there are already 54 participants, so better we start because we have a quite intense agenda for this webinar. Good morning again and welcome to this first webinar of the year on hybrid working. I'm Rosanna Burcheri. I'm Portfolio Manager at Artemis Investment Management. And I'm also co-chair of the Smart Working work stream at the Diversity Project. A year ago, most companies were forced to adopt remote working. And today, most companies are thinking and trialing how to adapt and adopt a hybrid workplace. It's not easy from what we have been hearing. And I'm sure there will be trials and error until each company sort of settle in what works for them. The Diversity Project is here to help. We have resources available on the website, case study, and we are kicking off with this one, a series of webinars to give you really all the information and all the help to really be able to make the right decision for your company. The webinar today is going to be focused on three main areas. To start with, we will be hearing from Greg Jones, employment lawyer and partner at Green & Green. He will touch upon recent trends in relation to flexible working, requests, grievances, and tribunal claims. You will then hear about the fact that well, the conversation is also alive in Parliament with Elena Morrissey in conversation with Caroline Knox, MP and chair of the Women and Select Committee. And finally, Emma Stewart, co-founder of Timewise, and an incredible help for the Diversity Project, will share what Timewise is seeing in the market in terms of different approaches across different industry on flexible working and how companies are really making a hybrid a success. Now, please use the Q&A function to send us all your questions. We'll gather them and ask to the different intervenants in the webinar. And with that, really, let's go to the core of this webinar to leave as much time to the person that are going to present and to you to ask the question. So let me introduce Greg Jones, partner and specialist human resource lawyer at Green & Green. Greg, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you, Rosanna. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay, and I'm happy for people to post questions as we're going along. But really, just to start by a thank you for having me along today, and thank you to the Diversity Project really for what you stand for, and also the amount of people that give up their time to drive change. Really, in an industry that perhaps is a bit further behind than others, but the initiatives and aspirations that you're setting really are to be admired. And I know one of the things that you talk about as an organisation a lot is about having male allies, which I certainly am, and I come to this conversation conscious that there are occasions where, as a male, that I should lean out of the conversation, and there are certain times when I should be leaning in to the conversation. And today I've been asked to lean in and talk about consequences potentially for employers. So how can we help you as managers, as individuals, as employers, to stay out of employment tribunals? Really, how can we help you avoid that reputational damage and ultimately the loss of a good employee where this goes wrong? So I work for a law firm, Green & Green, which is outside of London. We work for a lot of private, publicly listed organisations across the country, internationally, etc. But I focus on employment law. I live out in Woodbridge in Suffolk, and I suppose I should declare my interest in the conversation as well, is that my wife is in financial services. I've got two daughters. I even brought along, I was debating whether to wear this, but I thought it might be a bit small, the Strong Girls Club jumper. I do need to get one that fits me. And I've grown up 2 sisters, a single working mum, and I'm really passionate about equality of opportunity, but also the opportunity of hybrid working for men to take on more responsibility. I think very often over the years, the conversation has been around how can flexible working help mums go back to work? And actually, this changed the conversation. How can it be? How does hybrid working help men to support women in work? And for me, hybrid working is being able to work where and when in a way that works best for me or for employees and their employer. It's a win-win situation. And actually, this week has been quite a difficult week for me, in that last Monday we found out that my wife needed to go in for surgery on Sunday. So it was potentially an 8-hour operation. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to present today. I was thinking, gosh, I'm going to have all 3 kids. I've got 3 children under 8. How am I going to be able to do this? Well, the reality is I've been embracing hybrid working for a number of years. I've done drop-offs at nursery and pickups and spending time with children in the evenings and working late. But this week has been fantastic for me because I've been able to support my family at a time when they've needed it, but also still meet client demands. I'm working on a lot of projects. I've got clients closing sites, making hundreds, if not thousands of people redundant. You can balance both those needs. But I've also seen where it goes wrong. And I was presenting at an event recently on the benefits of diversity and inclusion. And I know that Emma will come on to talk about the benefits a little bit later. But really where it can go wrong, employees now are more willing to call managers out. So we've had the #MeToo, Black Lives Matter. Personally and nationally, through employment tribunal statistics, we are seeing more and more grievances and claims being brought. So I was talking to Jane Walsh, who was presenting at this event with me, and she was saying that we're not quite sure that managers really understand the consequences for them personally if they get this wrong. And a lot of managers will leave this to HR. It's hybrid working. Oh, it's a flexible working request. There was often a perception, oh, it's only a right to make a request, isn't it? We can quite easily turn it down, can't we? I remember looking at the policy and there are 8 reasons. We just say the burden of cost, don't we? And we don't embrace it. Well, that's quite dangerous. And there's lots of studies on high-performing teams. I'm a big fan of Hertzberg's 2-factor theory on the whole hygiene factors. You need to have clear policies and procedures in place, but also good relationships with your managers. You know, this shouldn't be a problem that's passed to HR. So we've got managers that are dealing with flexible working requests and having sort of on the front line in terms of hybrid working and embracing that, but perhaps not having the skills and experience. And the grievances and the claims that I see certainly could all be, I'm pretty sure it all could have all been nipped in the bud if managers had been a bit more confident in what was expected of them and how they could deal with when employees need support in the way and where they're working. So when we think about hybrid working, there are lots of legal sort of technical things that we should bear in mind. If someone's from home, well, what are we doing about data protection? How are you protecting your data? If you're processing lots of special category data, are you doing a data protection impact assessment? Fine. What about health and safety? Are people set up to work from home? Bearing in mind mental health, and there's lots of great resources on the Health and Safety Executive website. Yeah, that's brilliant. But the other thing we need to bear in mind is the right to request flexible working. So I'm seeing more and more people now receiving requests. So when lockdown restrictions eased towards the end of last year, and there were lots of campaigns to get us all back into the office, employers were saying to people, right, we need you back now. We need you back at your desk, and we need you back 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. And for lots of different reasons, people were saying that's just not going to work for me, because actually my children aren't back at school, that's an obvious one, or actually the wraparound clubs aren't there, you know, I can't have my nanny or whatever it would be supporting us. But also with mental health, people saying, actually, I feel really anxious about coming into work at peak time, you know, commuting, whether it's getting the tube, whatever their way into work might be. and I want to change the way that I work and where I'm working. That didn't really get a chance to bed in, because before we knew it, we were back in lockdown measures. But hopefully there is light under the end of the tunnel. You know, we were just having a conversation before coming on about people having jabs. You know, more and more people are having the vaccine, which is fantastic. So we're going to see more and more employers looking to bring people back to work. And we're going to start to see, and we already are seeing, more and more people saying, well, hang on a moment, I'm not happy to go back to the way we were working. You know, we talk a lot about building back better. You know, but potentially that's building back different to how we were before. So flexible working requests, you'll all probably be quite familiar with the fact that if you get a request and it's in writing, you've got 3 months to deal with it. That needs to include an appeal. You need to meet the individual, give them the right to be accompanied, all well and good. But if it's turned down, then what? Well, the Employment Tribunal don't even measure the amount of claims that are brought for breaches of flexible working rules. There's not really a stick there for many employers. And over the years, I've heard employers just say, oh, we don't want to publish our flexible working policy because it will encourage everyone to do it, and we don't want them to, do we? But what managers need to understand is how it interacts with other rights, and importantly, the Equality Act. Really important piece of legislation, which I'm sure everyone on this call will understand, but query whether or not they're bearing that in mind when you're looking at your hybrid working practices or your return to work practices, or do your managers appreciate when they're dealing with requests? So why is it important? Well, the Equality Act gives people with protected characteristics protection from discrimination. Okay, that's straightforward. Where it's a really quite weighty stick is that to bring a claim for discrimination, you don't have to have been employed for 2 years. So with unfair dismissal, so if you dismiss someone or someone feels that they've not been treated properly, they feel there's a repudiatory breach of contract, they could claim constructive unfair dismissal. And that's often been the biggest consequence. So if someone's not happy with the way you treat them, they could resign, claim constructive unfair dismissal. They've got to have 2 years service. But if someone is going to sue your organisation for discrimination, whether it be sex discrimination or disability discrimination, they can do that from day one, actually even as part of the application process. The other point to bear in mind is that compensation isn't capped like with unfair dismissal or constructive unfair dismissal. So if you had an employee who was unhappy about the way you're treating them, and they've resigned and claimed constructive unfair dismissal, is capped at around £80,000. Discrimination isn't capped. And the other point is that claims can be brought against individuals, so individual managers or directors. So what we're seeing, and we have seen for a long time, is claimants looking to bring claims against individuals because tactically it puts more pressure on the organisation, and preparing significant schedules of loss. And we're also seeing it's developing through the Employment Tribunal at the moment, whether or not there should be the remedy of interim relief. So if someone feels that they've been discriminated against, should they be able to apply to the Employment Tribunal to reinstate their employment whilst the outcome of the tribunal claim is pending? So we've had that with whistleblowing protection for a number of years. It doesn't happen very often, but it's a very powerful remedy. So let's just take an example. If you're saying we need employees to be in the office Monday to Friday or Monday to Thursday, 9 till 5, whatever your hours might be, you might find that female members of staff saying, actually, that's more difficult for me to comply with because of my childcare responsibilities. Or someone with mental health conditions might say, actually, in light of my anxiety, depression, whatever it might be, that doesn't work for me anymore. And if an employer just looks down the flexible working list and says, well, hang on a moment, burden of additional costs, detrimental impact on performance, we're not going to grant that request, move on. That individual now we are seeing is likely to be raising a grievance, potentially going straight to a tribunal claim. They're going to be issuing that claim against individuals, so the manager for turning it down, as well as the organisation, and they're going to be pretty chunky schedules of loss. So there's a significant stick there, as well as the carrots for getting it right, which we're going to come on to talk about. So what I've been working with a lot with clients recently is, what is the strategy on hybrid working? Why is a workplace important? We talk about bringing people back to the office. Why is that important for your organisation and your teams and the way that they work? Once you divide the strategy, it's looking at each of the teams, is it fit for purpose? Then looking at your policies. You've got to have a flexible working policy, and I know Emma will talk about this, but that is flexible. Lots of people, I heard a while ago saying that we're all going through the same storm, but we're all in different boats. And I think that's quite nice, and we need to appreciate that as employers, that everyone's going through their own journey here with COVID and the struggles, but it is an opportunity to change the way in which we work. But your policies have got to be fit for purpose. Employees have got to understand them. And then you need to create role models within the organisation. Embrace where hybrid working has been utilised successfully. Training for managers on those policies. How do they implement it? How do they have meaningful conversations? Communication is absolutely key. The Equality Act and the other employment protections are absolutely there as a consequence. It's like the gender pay gap reporting. Originally voluntary, not many people volunteered. We then needed to bring in a mandatory policy. Now more people are leaning in, they're producing their stats. There needs to be a consequence. What is it, employers, you've got to remember, is if you're facing that claim, you need to be able to confidently say, we are equal opportunities employers, here's our policies, we've trained our staff, they knew what was expected of them. And I tell you what, if we can get those things right, the risk or a grievance or a claim is automatically mitigated. There's just meaningful conversations with people when they're going on maternity leave, coming back from maternity leave, how flexible working support them, are confident, I am confident that you'll stay out of tribunal. I mean, we had 15 minutes, just a whistle-stop tour as to why employment law will hopefully help to drive change. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting to hear the next conversation on how legislation will continue to shape that. So, Helen, I think I'm now passing on to you.
Thank you so much, Greg. And it's wonderful to have heard from a fantastic male ally. Thank you so much. And we also, of course, need wonderful women who are championing change and making sure that we are emerging from this crisis and learning some of the positives. There has been a lot of trauma over the last year for everybody, as you rightly alluded to, but also we have seen ways of working that perhaps, we're surprised how we've been able to do it. Now, I've just got 15 minutes with the wonderful Caroline Noakes, who is MP for Romsey and Southampton North in Hampshire, as she's, as Rosanna said, also chair of the cross-party Women and Equalities Committee. And we're going to come back to that in a moment, but I just want to set out, we're going to have 5 minutes looking back at what's happened so far and your thoughts, Caroline, on the impact on women through this last year, particularly around working from home and some of the things that we are well documented but were covered in your report. Then I'd like to look forward, what you're hoping for, any legislation changes, etc. And then hopefully we'll have room for 5 minutes of questions. So please do use the Q&A and I'll integrate this into this part of the discussion today. The report that your group, the Women and Equalities Committee, put out at the end of January, Caroline, did make quite a splash. It was entitled Unequal Impact, Coronavirus and the Gendered Economic Impact. And I recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it. It's very thoughtful. It starts, acknowledges how difficult it's been for the government over the past year and that some of the policies had to be put in place in a hurry, but it's really quite critical of some of those policies and says that perhaps they inadvertently, but definitely did exacerbate gender inequality through the last year. Caroline, obviously the report is 50 pages and I'm not expecting you to go through the whole thing here, but just in your own words, just your kind of key message here about what you think we can learn from the past year and what your hopes are that the government does differently as we hopefully recover.
Thanks, Helena. And you're absolutely right. It's imperative, having been through a horrendous 13 months, a really difficult year, that we don't just look at the negatives, but we also think about what we can do differently. What are the lessons that we learned? And the report, when its conclusions were drawn and when we agreed it, I felt that it reinforced something that instinctively many of us had felt during the course of the previous, at that point, 10 months or so. We all knew, and from our own experiences, from the experiences of our staff, our friends, our colleagues, that women had carried the greatest share of childcare responsibilities, that they had done by far the largest proportion of homeschooling, that they were more likely to be furloughed than their male colleagues. Now, that was for many reasons, but one of them was because women were more likely to be working in those sectors which were shut down. So, for example, non-essential retail, hospitality, my big passion, which everybody knows about, the hair and beauty sector, well over 90% female employees. And it really did feel as if women had had a very rough deal. Now, I would always argue that part of that was because there were too few women represented when decisions were being made. So that very early decision to shut childcare, both formal and to ban the childcare of mum and dad, as I describe it. So the informal childcare went out the window as well. So if you were a frontline worker, you were left in that first lockdown with very little choice but to ask your employer for furlough purely for childcare responsibilities. But that was a late right or a late request that could be made that came in. And it felt to me as if women were, by and large, ignored whilst they were picking up all of those threads, the caring for elderly relatives, the making sure that your neighbours were okay, the fabulous sort of community spirit that we saw where people were really helping those around them enormously. And yet they were carrying a huge financial burden. So more likely to be furloughed, so they're surviving off 70% of their wages. More likely to be in a sector, potentially self-employed in a sector that's completely shut down. You've got no choice about whether you go to work, but also very significantly likely to be working in essential retail. So juggling that, I've got a child that should be in school, not necessarily a very young child in nursery, but we're talking primary age children who cannot be left alone whilst mummy goes out to work. But you have to learn from this. So my big ask for government have been, look, make sure, not as part of the report, but make sure that you have women in the room when you're making decisions. Secondly, look at all of these aspects, look at the sectors women are working in, look at the way they have shouldered the burden of childcare, find better ways to fund childcare. And I sometimes think it's too stereotypical for the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee to endlessly be talking about childcare, but it is such a key component to facilitating, and Piers Morgan picked me up on this, facilitating the ability of women to go back to work. And he said parents, he's right to say parents. And sometimes I have to have a little chat with myself and say, stop focusing on women, talk parents. But the reality is the stats are borne out. It was the women that were doing the hard work. So we have to learn from this. And we have to say, well, what was good? We did prove that you could work from home without necessarily having a drop in productivity. We did learn that you could be more flexible in the way you conducted your meetings. Who would have thought just over a year ago that we would do this sort of webinar and everyone would treat it as commonplace? This is ordinary now. Whereas beforehand, there was all that anxiety about whether the tech would work. And let's look to see what you can take from a really negative situation and bring it to the world of work, not just for women. And I'm going to have a little bit of a poke at Greg, who focused very heavily on women because it benefits the men too. And we have to give them the confidence to say, you know what, I want to work flexibly as well. This is not a right for women. This should be a right for everyone. And let's enable those dads to suddenly say, this isn't going to impact my career. This isn't going to mean that people forget the contribution I've made. It's going to be an opportunity for all of us. Now,
exactly.
Helena's going to ask me a question, which will give me my chance to tell you what I think the solution is.
Okay, well, there you go. That's now I've got to think backwards from that. I was going to ask the question in terms of, we heard from the Minister of Women and Equalities, Liz Truss, in March, just around International Women's Day, and she called for flexible working to be normalised and referred to, I thought it was quite an interesting study actually, that new research from what's they called Behavioural Insights team had looked into what happens when you advertise a role as being available for flexible working. I know this will be a subject very dear to Emma's heart when she comes on shortly, because Timewise is pressuring for all employers to advertise all roles as available for flexible working. In your report, you also then mentioned that one of the downsides of working from home is that it can be a sort of career death now. People aren't so visible. There's sort of, you might be working really hard and not, but yet getting the credit for it. So in my question that I'm trying to get you to have the opportunity to answer in the right way. Do you think that the government could do anything to really normalise flexible working? I know you talked in the report about a recommendation, specific recommendation to take off the 26-week service for requests for flexible work, so that might be a start. And then also any thinking, this is probably more as a working mother yourself, in terms of how to ensure that we don't lose out on careers. We don't want to end up that we're working hard but not progressing in our careers. So that is a very broad ranging question. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you. And I've had a lot of chats with Liz Truss about this, and I wanted to stand on my chair and start cheering when Liz started talking about normalising flexible working. I think it's great that we have government ministers that are prepared to talk the talk. I now want her to make sure, in her really key role as Minister for Women and Equalities, that they walk the walk. So that requires an employment bill. And we have a Queen's speech coming forward in just a few days' time now, which I believe we had a Queen's speech last time around that included an employment bill, and we've not seen the colour of the money on that one yet. So I've been quite, that for once is not my dog barking. I've been really quite adamant.
Just got my phone, mine on mute because it's my dog. Sorry about that, everyone.
We've got to have legislation for this. It's all very well to say, let's normalise it, let's talk about flexible working, let's find ways to encourage people to do it, let's legislate. And I think Greg made a really important point. The right to request it is there after your 6 months. Well, that should be from day one. But how are we going to encourage employers to actually grant the request? How are we going to empower people to have the confidence to ask for it? And I think that's a huge piece of work that I would like to see the DWP taking forward, giving people confidence in the workplace. It's the thing that I find most heartbreaking as a woman who now in her late 40s does not lack confidence. Once upon a time I did, and once upon a time I would have found some of those conversations really difficult to have. And I keep pointing that out to employment ministers, is look, you're going to have a tsunami of women. And they don't like me saying that. They say, no, Caroline, don't be so negative. But look at what's happening to retail on the high street. And think, if you will, about women, and I'll declare a slight bias, women in the prime of their life who might have worked for 20, 25 years in retail. It's going to change. It's going to change irrevocably. And so we have to, I want to see from the government some really proactive policies about retraining, about encouraging, and there's some great schemes out there, but I'm really worried that it's going to be sharp-elbowed 24-year-old men that sees them, and not slightly blunter-elbowed 45-year-old women who've had a really great career, who've worked hard, who've got an unblemished employment record, and through no fault of their own will find themselves redundant when furlough ends. So I think, first and foremost, that employment bill is absolutely key. And I think there could be some really exciting and innovative things that the Chancellor could do. And I spent my entire time with the Chancellor in my sites talking to him about what more could be done for women, a really key demographic to him. Let's face it, they make up more than 51% of the electorate. And so I want to see things like job share, where you have a double national insurance burden if you have a job share as the employer. And if that could be reduced, it might encourage employers to think, this could work, as opposed to automatically thinking, oh, this all looks very difficult and it'll be more expensive for me. So I think we need a lot of positivity from across government departments. We need to have legislation to back it up. And we need people like me getting really tetchy, which fortunately is something I do well, getting really, really cross about the fact that my committee put effectively a year's worth of effort into our report on the gender and economic impact of COVID. And the Government Equalities Office had a duty to respond to me by, I think, about the 9th of April, and they still haven't. And when they don't respond to me, they don't answer the recommendations, they don't bring forward their own proposals, because I would be happy to accept that. Then they can expect further tetchiness from the committee, because we need a response and they're obliged to give us one.
Well, hear to that. I've a few follow-ups, including in the chat. Thanks for the questions coming through. I'm going to leave the difficult legal one to Greg, just so you know, Greg, there's one there about a post around the Law Commission. So I'm going to leave that one to you. There's a lot in the discussion, and I think it is a very important topic around, this being more parent, this being about normalising men and women's lives. And I personally think this is, the big way forward in terms of cultural change. We can have some legislation perhaps, but until you have a focus more on men and women living those equal lives. And Greg, I think you got a bit of a hard time from Caroline then. You'd already announced that you were doing all the childcare this week, so let's acknowledge that. But the I guess it's difficult for government, and this is something that Liz Truss, I mean, this was in a private conversation, but I don't think she'd mind particularly saying it. She said, how can government tell families how to divide the responsibilities? So I'm going to put that one to you, Caroline. I know it's slightly off message or off the point in terms of what government can do, but it does strike me as a really a significant impediment to normalizing what has been a normal situation this past year in terms of everybody working from home, not just mothers.
So I'm going to do that awful politician thing by not answering the question. I think the point I would most like to make to Liz about this is, look, we had the suspension of the enforcement of the gender pay gap reporting. Fundamentally, families will make decisions according to what is in their fiscal best interests, and they won't have had a choice about that. And they will have looked at parents' salaries, and they will have taken a decision, a really tough economic decision. Actually, that's where the burden of the childcare is going to fall. Sorry, I always try and avoid using the word burden. It's not a burden, it's a joy. I can say that. My daughter is 22. She has been no trouble during lockdown. And my homeschooling involved making sure she finished her dissertation. So that's why families have made those decisions, because they've had to, because when it comes down to the cold hard cash, you don't have a choice. So I was really pleased to see the Equalities and Human Rights Commission bring back enforcement around gender pay gap reporting. But I think it was Greg who made the point that unless you enforce it, unless you make it mandatory, companies won't report. And we saw a massive drop off. I think it went down to a third of the number of companies that reported in Feb 2020 reported in Feb 2021 because there was no enforcement, and so they didn't need to. And so I was really pleased to see that come back. But we have to make sure that there is more work done to drive down that gender pay gap. We have to make sure that when we're giving careers advice to young people, we are, and nobody likes me sounding like a sort of really hardline Tory at this, we are encouraging girls when they're making their career decisions to think about their purses and what the long-term career prospects are and what they're going to earn. Not an esoteric conversation about what do you think you would like. Where do you want to be in life? What do you want to achieve? Where do you want to live? How many times do you want to go on holiday? Well, look, go become an engineer and you'll do all of that. And I think that is part of the challenge. So what can government do now? I think that they need to be prioritising a Kickstart scheme, green apprentices, all of those areas in which there has been a real problem with attracting young women to sign up. They have to make sure that the language of their job adverts is not alienating to women, and have a real focus around, look, when you go into raising a family, you do it as a partnership. So let's make sure that we have empowered both men and women to be able to be equal partners in those relationships. And Liz would probably hate that, you know, me being terribly bossy about how people should live their lives. But, you know, it's not important.
Bossy, we're assertive. So I'm going to just steal time for one last question. And that is really, you know, you've alluded to it really by saying, you know, you haven't had a reply to the report. The report was published on the 26th of January. It's now about the same date in April, 27th of April. That is quite a long time. Let's be fair, the government has got a lot on its plate. Let's be honest about that. Fiscally, morally, you know, there's a lot on its plate. Is there enough bandwidth? Is this getting the attention it deserves from your perspective, Caroline? And if not, what can businesses do to elevate the subject?
So equalities matters to all of us. And the thing that has struck me in this role over the last year or so is how committed business has been to driving forward change, to having really open and frank conversations about what they can do better, what they can do. You know, with things like ethnicity pay gap reporting, they're crying out to me saying, what can you do to force the government to introduce a framework so that we know what we should be reporting? Because we want to report, we want to get that right, but we want to be able to be compared with other comparable businesses. And so do I think there is enough focus on equalities from the government at the moment? No. Liz is in a role as Secretary of State for International Trade that is crucially important. She has to spend her time negotiating with foreign governments all around the globe. And I have to say she is doing a fabulous job of negotiating.
Yeah, yes.
And her eye is not on equalities. And she would know that I would say that, and she wouldn't be cross with me for saying that. So I have long said we need to have a Secretary of State permanent fixture around the cabinet table for women and equalities, or maybe just equalities, and to make sure that that agenda is being driven forward, not just in the silo that is the Government Equalities Office, but across every single department, so that when a policy is brought forward from the DFE, the DWP, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, they're looking at things through an equalities lens and saying, is this making life better for people with protected characteristics, whether they're male, female, able-bodied, disabled, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their background, and do it with real passion. And I think that really matters.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Well, I was going to ask, should the role be split, but, you know, and the portfolio be separated? I've always thought it seems always a bit tacked on to something else, and that something else, as Liz's role is, can sometimes be a giant portfolio. So I'm glad we agree on that. But you can count on us for helping the Women and Equalities Committee in any way we can, and for continuing to put pressure on ourselves really to deliver on equality. I think we have a great moment here. It has been a tough 13 months, but we have a moment to change how we operate. Fund management, investment and savings are very traditional. Greg, you were very polite about saying we're a little bit further behind. And we see that this is a moment to see. So let's look forward to working as closely as we can with you, Caroline, so that we can make progress together. But thank you so much for spending the time with us this afternoon. And I'm delighted now to welcome, as Rosanna said, a very great friend of the Diversity Project, Emma Stewart, co-founder and CEO of Timewise, who's going to share with us some of the lessons we can learn from other industries who've adopted hybrid working practices. Over to you, Emma.
Anna, thank you. Delighted to be here. And I think we've been working with you for about 2 years now as a strategic partner. So really delighted to be talking about flexible working and now hybrid. Caroline, I couldn't agree with you more on everything you said. Just some data to back you up. Last year, even though we all changed the way we worked, only 8% of job vacancies said part-time at the point of hire. And we're probably going to have about 1 million women coming off furlough onto benefits. So we need more flexible jobs from day one. It's a real hard fact. But today I'm going to talk to you a bit about hybrid and I guess really some reflections, as Hannah said, on what other firms are doing, what other businesses are doing, and maybe also a bit on what good should look like as we come out the other side of this as well, in terms of diversity and inclusion. Just very briefly, by way of introduction, Timewise is a social business. We've been shouting about flexible working for 15 years, so the last year has been an interesting one for us. We do lots of research, thought leadership, and crucially for this conversation, go into businesses every day and help them through our consultancy work get better at flexible working. So our clients range from many of the FTSE 500s through to NHS Truss, to construction companies, and even the Scottish Government. And most recently, we've been advising many on hybrid. So I thought I'd touch on 3 things. Firstly, really just what are we seeing in firms who are getting this right? And there's something really, firstly, to say at a leadership level, that is what I'm calling kind of flexible working home truths. So the firms that are getting this right have learned some things from this last year. They've learned that, as we've all said, the reasons to say no have largely been disproven. Trust and performance levels have been maintained. They've learned also, and they are increasingly learning, that hybrid working is just one form of flexible working, that fundamentally what they need to aspire to is giving people autonomy and control over how much, where and when they work. And all of those matter. And if you can get it right, it shouldn't be diametrically opposed to performance. It's in fact the opposite. And they've also learned, if they didn't know before, that the vast majority of people want to retain some form of flexibility. So if we want to keep great people and attract more great people, we need to be offering flexibility going forward. But the firms have also learned quite a few watch outs. I mean, we've all said countless times how we worked last year wasn't sustainable. I sort of think about it in terms of there's sort of 3 different kinds of strain that I think we've had through the last year. One has been a well-being strain. We are still working in the UK the highest over hours of any country in Europe. So we haven't worked really genuinely inclusively, flexibly. We've got a connectivity strain. People have been feeling really disconnected. Offices do matter. And we also have an inclusion strain. It's not been the same experience for everybody. Women obviously have been significantly impacted more broadly, but also people who work in frontline industries and about half the population, in fact, who can't take a laptop and work from home in the jobs that they do, such as our care workers and our nurses. So what are firms learning from this in terms of just those that have recognised some of those home truths? Well, the first thing to say is what we're seeing across industries is everyone is still working this out. This is the hard bit. This is harder than the last bit. One client of ours recently said, we're just stumbling through, we're structuring it, but we're testing and we're trying and we're learning. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that none of us have the answer. This is unprecedented at scale, different ways of working. What we're seeing is most employees want a blend. So the bulk of requirements are in the middle, are about a hybrid blend of work and office. Some people, but very few, want all home, and some want all office. And what we're seeing in the main in terms of trends is most firms looking to a ratioed solution, which is part office and again part home. So there's a lot in hybrid. When we work with clients at Timewise, we talk about setting up principles, processes, and then implementation. I thought best just to touch, because we've only got a couple of minutes, on some of the principles that are really important and what we're seeing across other industries. So 4 things to call out. The first is a leadership principle. As with everything, it starts with leadership. But good leaders who are doing this well in firms are moving from reactive to proactive. They are recognising that the non-conversations, that I won't talk to you about how you're working at a performance review as much as your outputs, is no longer good enough. And they are being really planful in how they think about communicating this. So yes, they need to set a vision, but crucially, they're putting a team in place, and their teams are not just D&I. These are teams that sit across transformation, they sit across operations and commercial teams, because we need to do that when we're thinking about hybrid. They have a team. This is bigger than D&I, and we need frameworks to make this work. So the kind of questions that these firms are asking their teams is, to what extent are we going to have to change our business model because of hybrid? How do we consider our client base? What's the service scope? What are the client teams' interactions going to be like? Right through to how to remunerate people if they want to move overseas. A lot of firms are starting to put guidance in place about retaining workforce within commutable distance. So these are big, big questions that need to be addressed. And good leaders are setting teams up in place to try and work through some of the answers, even if they don't have them all today. The second principle is around trust. As with everything, again, hybrid teams and good organisations rely on trust. So in professional services, we're seeing some really interesting work. PwC, I will call out, have something called the deal. They've moved from an evolution of talking about everyday flexibility to empowered flexibility. They trust their teams to do this. There's 2 layers of trust. One is around leadership trusting managers to work this through effectively in their teams. And the other is line managers trusting their people to deliver their work well and be responsible and conscientious, even if you can't see them. And that behavioural shift is just really, really critical in order to emphasise the change we need to see. The third principle is around a sort of outcome-based mindset. And again, we often talk, when we think about flexibility, as managing by outputs. In hybrid, there's a layer beneath that, which we talk about in the context of intentional co-located time. So when we are thinking about hybrid environments, we need to make distinctions between synchronicity of our work. So when do we need to be together in teams? When does that need to be remote? When does that need to be in person? And asynchronous work. When can we work on our own? Because this isn't the old world of request response. I'll wait as a manager for somebody to ask me to work flexibly. We are all doing this. So we have to look at it in that matrix sense. So organisations are doing this well. So in the legal profession, Linklaters, who we've been working with, they have an L&D global team set up that have developed a toolkit to basically help their teams to relearn how they work. And they are asking questions, to what extent are we considering location and time on projects? To what extent are we considering jobs and tasks? And to what extent are we making sure that when we're in the office, we're really collaborating? So someone from another firm said to me the other day, I came into the office for the first time. The director of the team sat in their office for 4 hours of the day. We should not be doing that anymore. When we're in the office, we're walking the floor, we're meeting, we're talking, we're engaging, we're doing different things in offices. That's what hybrid really means. And then the third principle is, and really critical for the diversity project, we know, and an issue really close to your heart, is just having an inclusive approach when we think about hybrid. Again, there's some real concerns, and we are seeing in the market generally, but within firms, about hybrid bias. So if you are the one at home, you know, how do you avoid the water cooler moment where the meeting's finished and people are having a chat, and that's where work gets planned, and that's where people get given work. We need to make sure we're not moving into a two-tier. And there's some practical things and some bigger things. The practical things, firms are in the main that are doing this well, relying on Zoom, Teams, laptops for everybody, no matter whether you're in the office or not, for meetings. It just creates that flat structure. But also making sure that people who aren't visible aren't ignored, and that will require more communication. And it's clunky at the moment, but we need to be doing that to get it right. And then absolutely critical in terms of thinking about flexibility and inclusiveness is just not forgetting the other types of working flexibly. So part-time matters, working less matters to so many people, and start and finish times. So it's not just about where you're working, but the amount of work that you're doing. An example, again, left field, is the construction industry. We've recently worked with BAM Construct, and they have recognised that they're at risk of two-tier. They've got knowledge workers who can take laptops and work from home, and then they've got people on site loading concrete, and they can't have one rule for one and one for the other. So their strapline, their new strategy that we supported them on in relation to Flex, is that they believe that flexibility is possible for every role, but it's not going to be the same for every role. And I just think that's quite a smart way of articulating this. So, so those are just really just touching on 4 things. Underpinning all of that, as Greg mentioned, is training teams to do this. This won't just happen by osmosis. A flexible working policy is not going to be enough anymore. This is about having a framework and a strategy, and obviously making sure that all the technology is in place to do it. So a bit on hybrid, and then I just thought for a couple of minutes, just very briefly, what do we want to see change? We have a huge opportunity. If we do this well, the next 6 to 12 months is about how do we just change the way we work. But I've just got 4 thoughts and hopes, I guess. The first is that we've used this opportunity to genuinely change our culture and behaviours within the industry, to really recognise flexibility is a good thing, and we can trust people. The second is that we understand that you can have flexibility in every role. It can work whether you're a nurse, whether you're a teacher, whether you work in financial services. We can do that, and we can look beyond remote working in order to achieve it. Thirdly, that I think we need fair, flexible access for all. So, a junior colleague in financial services, somebody you're onboarding now, will have challenges, but there are also opportunities to be able to explore how they work, and not just reward term of service with some form of flexibility. And then finally, and Helena will know I'm going to say this because I always do, that we have flexible working from day one. So last year, revolution in how we worked, the employment market changed, the recruitment market hasn't. We still only have 2 in 10 jobs that state flexible working is available from day one. And if we can learn one thing from this, if we want to be competitive as organisations, attract great people, and make sure that we walk the talk around diversity and inclusion, then we should, as a given, be explicitly saying we're open to the conversation about flexibility from day one. So, so lots of stumbling through, but I think a goal in sight, and I hope that's been helpful.
Thank you, Emma. Very, very helpful. And I have a few questions that have been feeded through the Q&A. If I can start, maybe Greg, because I think is something that has come up in few questions. I think you hint a little bit about what is better to do before arriving to the employment tribunal. But how would you suggest a conflict can be resolved if the employee preference and the employer preference don't match for hybrid working or times for flexible working?
Sure. So I think there's 2 parts to that question. One is just on a personal level, dealing with that conflict with the individual. And I'd encourage anyone who hasn't looked at it yet, to go on and have a look at Mind's emotional needs met model. And it talks about how we all have emotional needs, and if they're not being met, that can lead to mental health problems. So if you're losing control, meaning or purpose, security, all things that might be out of sync at the point when you're making a flexible working request, you are going to be feeling stressed. So we need to acknowledge that it's going to be a difficult time, that we may be having this conversation for that individual. Secondly, where there is a conflict, so where an employer is saying, well, hang on a moment, this is our policy, we need people to be working from the office at these times, then potentially that's indirectly discriminatory on grounds of sex, disability, and potentially religious belief. But with indirect discrimination, employers are able to objectively justify why that's needed. So what often happens is employers will go back, they'll turn down the request, they'll say we need people in, but they haven't done enough work around that objective justification. So when we end up in employment tribunal, we're having to piece it together retrospectively. So what I would say is, if there's a conflict, why is there a conflict? Why do you need that person to be working in a particular way? Bearing in mind what Emma's talked to us about, there are very few occasions where that will genuinely be the case now, but where there is, document it, have your proper assessment, set out why is it you need this to be the case. So if you do get faced with a claim, we can objectively justify why you came down on the side of the organisation rather than the individual.
Yeah, thank you. I think we go back to the point that, you know, it has to be part of the sort of ongoing communication between employee and employer. Another question on the legal, and then I'll move to Emma because there are a few questions for you. But another one on the legal side, Greg, is, and effectively I'm also following Anna Whitehouse on LinkedIn, and she's been talking about the law reform that she took along to the Law Commission with 4 top female employment law and barrister. I think they're focused on the Flexo Forever report. I mean, is it something that is it talk? How can we deliver, and how, you know, can we do something to support it? Is actually a viable way to push the the problem forward?
Sure, I think that's probably. I appreciate Caroline's had to drop off, and probably a question for her in terms of how that will be received. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the employment bill plays through. I suppose the question is, how do we drive change? You know, what is it we're trying to drive in terms of diversity? I know that the Diversity Project has talked about halving the gender pay gap by 2030. How does flexible working accommodate that? And I come back to the point that I made earlier, is that hybrid working is a great opportunity for men to share in responsibilities, those family responsibilities. But at the moment, there's still a cost. If we look at shared parental leave, that was introduced a few years ago by the coalition government, take up on that has been minimal, absolutely minimal. Because how can you possibly survive on 50% of the national living wage when you've got to support a family? Whereas there's some great organisations, Aviva is one, as an example, where they've offered full pay for 6 months, mother or father or parent, and potentially you take a year off. That is where I think we'll start to see the shift in who is responsible for parenting, and we'll break down some of that stigma. And I think until that happens, until we change shared parental leave, the support, the financial support, and breaking down the barriers so it enables men to join into the conversation and help with that responsibility, I think we'll struggle.
Can I just
Maybe
add to that, Rosanna, sorry, that just to show how much that has had an impact. So Aviva now has an almost 50-50 take-up of shared parental leave between men and women. So it's not just they put the policy in place and then people, because sometimes people say, oh, you know, they won't do it until there's lots of senior role models or whatever, but it is genuinely, going back to the point that were made earlier, often a very rational financial consideration for a couple to prioritize the man's career. So, and it's worked at Aviva. So that's 3 years in, it's gone to 50% almost take up by men.
It's amazing. Emma, some question for you that I would like you to address. I think sometimes is down to little practical thing, because I think the rise, for example, working from home has tested the boundaries where employee and employer responsibility begin and end. And so there are questions like, does the employer has to pay for the Wi-Fi, has to pay for the other bills? So just interesting to know what you're seeing in other industry and how companies have addressed this situation.
I mean, as a basic requirement, companies should make sure from a health and safety perspective and from I think it's legislative as well, but that they need to make sure that people working from home have the setup they need to be able to work from home. I think we've got to be a bit careful that just because people had to work from home through the pandemic, and so you had 5 young people in a flat all sharing an ironing board for a desk, that's not sustainable. And so I think but most smart firms have recognised that they need to put tech and equipment and facilities in place to enable people to work from home. So I would expect that firms are doing that. If not, then that would be a concern. Obviously, very small businesses are still, again, stumbling their way through this. I think the bigger issue is how to support different cohorts of people who want to be able to continue to work from home, so that they are able to communicate properly and be part of that organisation and feel part of the culture. And I think that's the behavioural cultural piece is the bit we really need to be focusing on. We should have got, if I'm honest, we should have got the technology sorted a long time ago. It's not complicated.
Yeah, and actually on the behavioral change, because I think it's quite important, and it's something that we are seeing in terms of feedback, and it's coming out also in one of the questions, because effectively now with the reopening of the office, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where maybe there is a meeting and half of the people are in the office, half are remotely, and how we get the inclusivity and make the people that are at home for XYZ reason or whatever, that they actually are part of the meeting. And yes, it's a behavioral change that you're asking people to make the effort. But do you have any suggestion, what can be a good trick that other industry, other companies have been using to make sure that that there is really this inclusiveness?
Depends on how teams, it depends on teams and how work and teams are structured. And actually, so it's less sectoral and it's more about the team dynamic, if I'm honest. So, and the nature of those teams and even the nature of those roles, because if you are a team of creatives, you will need to interact more together physically to be able to, and all the evidence shows, to get work done. If you are in planning and org roles, you can often work much more independently. So I think I would advise the way to think about this is to think about it not necessarily by what's everybody else doing in other industries, but what are the roles and the functions that we have in our firm, and how can we best encourage people to collaborate, and really thinking planfully about not just a sort of 3 days in the office, 2 days from home, Monday to Friday, which is going to ruin the transport system, notwithstanding everything else. But at what points is it useful for our team to come together physically in the office? And there will be what people are calling sort of bundling, where you will end up with more people in on certain days, because the very nature of a team coming together as a team means you're going to have peaks and troughs. So again, a note of caution for those firms that are starting to look at real estate and seriously thinking about leases is to just be careful, because this is going to take a bit of time and practice to get right. And we'll probably have quite a lot of peaks and troughs, because you want to come into the office when your manager is in, because you want to nab them and you want that level of engagement. So there's going to be a flow of more people in on particular days and less on other days. But not to do the Monday to Friday thing at home is not necessarily the right way to do it.
Right. Okay. There is one thing that I want to also share with everybody. I mean, you have heard from Caroline Knox. I mean, as the diversity project, we're trying to give her and other member of parliament that are very closer to the cause all the material, all the result of the survey. But there is one thing that has come out also from what Caroline said, that it's really clear that actually changes can be driven by business, and yes, like I said at the beginning, like Emma said, it's a trial and error, and it's perfectly normal. Myself, in my daily job as a fund manager, I meet all these fantastic company across the world, and I'm always fascinating all the fantastically written objective and aims that are based on integrity, stronger culture, communication, transparency. But in a certain way, you know, that's the time. That's the time for corporate to show what is a strong culture. And yes, there's going to be trials and errors, but you're going to get there. And it's the time for corporate actually also to show what it really means to communicate and leave really the communication open between employers and employee. Now, I hope that we have given you a little bit of food for thought. I mean, for me, I was taking a lot of notes, and there are a lot of things that we'll probably follow up. But one thing that I want you to be sure, I mean, we are here to try to help. This is actually the first webinar of a series of webinars that we're gonna run. And the following webinars, we have asked a few companies in our industry and in the fintech industry, and I'm chasing in the tech industry, just to showcase how they've achieved their hybrid working or flexible working new policy. How do they get there? What their pros and cons? So you're going to have a sort of lively example in the next 2 to 3 months of how other companies have done. And then hopefully you're going to get all the instrument or all the little piece of the puzzle to get to your result. I really thanks Greg, Emma, and Caroline that I had to leave, and thanks Ellen again for your incredible help. If you have any question or follow up, you know how to join us, and I hope to see you for the next webinar. Is going to be new ways of working. With the first showcase is going to be Aberdeen Standard, and it's going to be, if I remember well, is the 12th of May. So watch for the invitation in your inbox. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.